everyone to our presentation. My name is Aviel.
I'm Tal.
I'm Nathan.
And I'm Ryan.
So in this presentation, we're going to be looking at the use of high frequency currents as a treatment for different ailments in the 20th century and also possible reasons for its decline. So just an introduction. So plasma medicine is at the forefront of innovation and potentially non-invasive medical treatments. However, it wasn't always popular, and electrotherapeutics saw a decline in the 20th century. And in this presentation, we're going to be looking at the possible reasons for its decline. So first thing we're going to do is look at historical accounts of the devices and the treatments that they use, whether they're researchers or practitioners. And we're going to look at the decline and consider also the reputation of the field of electromedicine as a whole, and also its competition with other treatments that are coming out, such as X-rays and pharmaceuticals.
All right, so just as an example of some of the research that was taking place earlier on that kind of sparked this interest in electrotherapeutics initially, here's an example of one of them. It was basically an experiment that was done with mice where they implanted a tumor in the mice, and they then applied a high frequency current treatment to these mice, and they found that it was actually somewhat effective. Unfortunately, many of the mice died due to bacterial infections, so they maybe didn't have the best sanitization at that time. But a pretty small number died from the tumor itself, and 25% survived. So there was definitely some promise here in terms of being able to treat the cancer using high frequency currents. Another study here was looking at how high frequency currents might affect the metabolism, and they conducted this experiment in dogs. They basically gave these dogs a high frequency current treatment, and they found that it increased the metabolism in these dogs. And this was noted by an increased body temperature, decreased CO2, which is likely as a result of an increased ventilation rate. There was also a decrease in blood sugar and an increase in waste products. And this is symbolized right here in this graph. And it's basically just showing that there's high frequency currents increase the metabolism when applied. So now I'm just going to kind of summarize some of the earlier research that took place that sort of started this field of high frequency currents. So there's two of the first researchers were D.R. Sunval and Tesla. D.R. Sunval was more focused on the heat that he found was increased as a result of high frequency currents. And Tesla noted that there was also a chemical component here. So it wasn't just the heat, but there was also an increase in ozone and nitrogen species in the applied area. Nagelschmidt, he coined this term called diathermy, which is just basically describing the heat that is required as part of the high frequency current treatment in order for them to have a therapeutic effect. And there's another study here that was conducted in 1924 that showed that when you implant tumors in plants, you can actually reduce the tumor size and kill the cancer cells using high frequency currents. And this last study here is the one that I mentioned previously with the mouse sarcoma. So all of these kind of show that there is a promising effect of high frequency currents in treating cancer. So one of the questions that came up around this time was, is it the heat associated with the high frequency currents that are leading to its effect, or is it a specific component within, inherent in the high frequency currents that is leading to the effect? So one researcher named Ryder showed that when he was able to eliminate the effects of heat and only look at the effect of the high frequency current without the heat effects. And he found that there was still an effect, which would indicate that there is a specific effect of high frequency currents. There's something special about them specifically, as opposed to other methods of increasing heat. But his study was refuted by many studies at the time, which didn't found the opposite. They found that the heat is pretty much the only aspect of the high frequency currents that was leading to its effect. They didn't find that the high frequency currents specifically had an effect aside from the heat that it produced. And so this led to this idea here that's summarized here by this article that was published in 1940, which is basically summing up this idea that the effect of these short radio waves, or also known as high frequency currents, are due to the heat produced and not necessarily a specific action. So this kind of led to this idea of, why would you use high frequency currents when you could use a different, external application of heat? You could use another method of increasing heat. You don't necessarily need to use the specific mechanism. And that's summed up here in this quote. And so this is just one kind of hypothesis for how high frequency currents declined and lost some momentum around this time, is because there was sort of a focus on the increase in local heat that was caused by the high frequency currents, and less of a focus on the chemical component, the reactive nitrogen and oxygen species, which we know today that that's actually likely to play a more important role than just the heat itself. And this is actually shown by some of Dr. Keidar's research. So this is one mechanism for why the high frequency currents lost some momentum around this time.
Okay, so before I get into George Lukowski and talk about what he invented with the radio cellular oscillator, also known as the Multiwave Oscillator, I'm going to give a brief background on him. He was an ethnic Russian and French engineer and scientist. He was born in Minsk, Russia in 1869, and he studied and engineered in Odessa, Russia, and he moved in France in 1984. He became well known as a pioneer for the multi-wave oscillator. And as he persisted, he patented and invented it in 1924. The oscillator produces either low frequencies or high frequencies that are in the gigahertz range, so it can range between the two. And to claim that each and every cell in an organism, whether it be a plant, an animal, or an animal cell, has its own unique frequency where the cell can thrive. So as you can see here on the right-hand side, we have the oscillator machine, and it generates frequencies where it aligns the cell and the microbe together. So when they aren't aligned with one another, illness or sickness can come up and start. But when the frequencies are generated and they do align, it helps to cure it, and it brings it together so that it can be able to be cured. It has very weak frequencies and weak vibrations. It heals much quicker, whereas if it has higher frequencies, you need more energy to be able to oscillate them to bring them closer together. The multi-wave oscillator functionality was to simply calibrate and promote vibration equilibrium within the cells. The oscillator's technique does not kill the microbe, but aligns the oscillation of various cells. The cells, when placed in a field of multiple vibrations, find their own frequencies to oscillate. And so as we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about a couple of trials where it takes place, where a plant was inoculated with cancer. There's 3 different plants that were done so with 3 different techniques. One was oscillated twice for 3 hours. Another one was oscillated 11 times for 3 hours. And the third was oscillated 3 times for 3 hours. When the oscillation happened on the cancer, the plant, initially afterwards, the plant tumor grew rapidly and spread around the plant. But exactly 16 days after the time where the first treatment had occurred, it slowly started to shrivel up and slowly started to die. It was only affected only on the point of impact on the cancer where the remaining cell aspect of it wasn't harmed in any way or fashion. It was a healthy plant, but the point where the cancer was a part where it was affected and it started to slowly dry up in that spot. We will see in the next slide, but before we get to that, there's a control where it occurred where 16 plants were also inoculated with cancer that were left without treatment. Their tumors were in full activity and it grew very large. These experiments show conclusively that plants inoculated with cancer can be treated and cured by means of the ultra radio frequency vibrations, where surgical treatment fails. So the oscillations were pointed directly at the cancer where it helped to decline it, whereas in surgery, it did not work and it was a failure. In the next slide, we'll see a subject matter of a human being before, during, and after trials with the multiple-wave oscillator, where as you can see on the left-hand side, before there's a person with skin cancer on their face. During the oscillation, when it was intact, when it was going through the process, you can see around the skin, it was healthy, nothing was affected, but only the part of the skin that had the cancer slowly started to decline. And then after, it completely went away. So you can see there's a progress into it. I'm going to hand it over to Nate, where he's going to talk more into trials about Lukowski.
Thank you. Radiation and waves was a part in Sources of Our Life by George Lukowski. And in his source, he had some introductions to supplemental human trials with his multiple wave oscillator. So this trial in specific took place in St. Louis Hospital, which is in Paris. A 68-year-old patient in the corner of the eye was treated with the oscillator September 8th, and it concluded on November 19th, and there were significant results. As you can see on the right, there's two pictures, figure 5 and 6. It shows that the oscillator was effective. Next slide, please. And then this is another case that took place in Sweden. So different places and different physicians. This one is Professor Sven Johansson, this professor treated radium dermatitis. And the professor said, after treatment with your apparatus, which was a multiple wave oscillator, for a few months, the radium dermatitis is completely cured, as well as the inflammation of the joint and the mobility of the finger is considerably restored. So figures 12 and 13 show that the radium dermatitis was in fact healed. It shows that the oscillator was effective. Next slide, please. And these are some more case studies. What we're essentially trying to do is we're just trying to show that the oscillator was effective through different means and through different physicians and even different areas. So this actually took place in New York. This is about like 20 cases in the source. There was more cases in the source, but we just picked out this one in particular. So they were treated with Lukowski's multiple wave oscillator, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but the illnesses, the treatment numbers and the results were predominantly well. So then again, showing that the oscillator was effective to some extent. Next slide, please. So another physician, which was a urologist in the States, actually in New York, in Brooklyn, and we see that, the cases on the left, we have illnesses, for example, acute urinary retention, and then the retention stopped. So basically the data presented by Lukowski, which was in the source, showed improvements with treatment using his multiple wave oscillator. And what we essentially tried to do was we tried to find reasons to provide proof that Lukowski's therapies weren't sufficient, because we were trying to find the reason why these types of therapies decline. So we tried to find the reason. We were trying to look, and I thought that maybe his oscillator wasn't good and that's why it declined. But according to his case studies and human trials and even testimonials in his text, we were unable to find a reason on the decline of his therapy. Rather, his therapies exhibited success in his trials. And furthermore, the next slide will touch on speculations on why Lukowski's therapies declined. So We came up with a couple of reasons. So during World War II, Lakhovsky fled to the US and he died in a car accident. So the healthcare personnel that were using his oscillators they didn't really know how to repair it. They didn't know how to use it properly. And when he passed away, unfortunately, it's kind of went out of commission. In the 1980s, his work was slowly being rediscovered again. They didn't have his devices, but his works were being, they were being studied again. And in a source that we found in 2009, they found one of his oscillators in a attic and it was donated to a research center. So now they're kind of looking more into it. And towards the end of our presentation, we're going to kind of touch up on the future of high frequency currents and electrotherapeutic devices.
So Dr. Reif was he was an American inventor. And on the left, you can see the machine that he invented. He actually invented a couple versions of this machine. And I think this one is number 5. So just some background, he was inspired by the works of Abrams, Tesla, and Lakhovsky. And so how does the machine work? So basically there's a tube filled with noble gases, usually neon or helium, and electric current passes through the tube, and then it excites the gases, and then there's electromagnetic radiation that's released. And so along with the radio waves that are being oscillated, there's also an audio wave oscillator that in conjunction together, they're going to be applied to the affected area for treatment. And we'll get more into the treatment in the next slide. So what exactly was the theory behind his invention? So he theorized that every cell has a unique resonance frequency or mortal oscillatory rate, MOR, at which it destabilizes. So basically it vibrates and then eventually it reaches a certain resonant frequency at which it lyses. And pathogenic cells have a different MOR from healthy cells because they have different levels of reactive oxygen species and other elements. So through experimental trials, he was able to determine the MORs for different pathogenic cells. And once he was able to find them, he was able to devitalize them and apply the treatment. So the treatment plan was administering the beam for 3-minute durations every 3 days. And the reason why he did it every 3 days was to give time for the lymphatic system to get rid of the lyse cells, because he didn't want them to build up in the body. And even though we don't have the majority of his records, unfortunately, we have one famous record which is has been recorded is in 1934, 16 patients came to his clinic, either with tuberculosis or cancer, and 14 of them were clinically cured just after 3 months of treatment with his device. And 2 of the patients, they reported a recurrence of their cancer. The results were still pretty solid because there can be a recurrence of cancer even with chemotherapy and other types of therapies. So possible reasons for the decline. So Philip Hoyland was the engineer that built the Rife ray. And just to briefly summarize this entire thing, it gets a little complicated. But we mentioned there were 2 oscillators, an audio wave oscillator and a radio wave oscillator. So they thought that the audio wave oscillator was the main thing running the show, right, behind the treatments. But in 2003, we tested, scientists were able to obtain and test 3 original Rife rays. And they found out that the frequency of the carrier frequency, which is the radio wave oscillator, was actually also very important. It played a critical role, and if that frequency was changed, then that would affect the calculations made in calculating the MOR. And this was unbeknownst to Dr. Rife himself, and the only one that knew it was Philip Hoyland, but he hid it because he didn't want competitors to steal the invention and replicate it. So this lack of knowledge behind the principles of the Rife machine led to a rejection of the Rife machine as a legitimate treatment for cancer and resulted in the production of many self-proclaimed Rife machines on the market that were shown to be ineffective. So in the next slide, we'll see how that affected the field. So this resulted in the mainstream medical community failing to verify its legitimacy, and partially due to a lack of proper understanding behind electrotherapeutics in general, and also the marketing and sale of phony electrotherapeutic devices created a blemish on its reputation, and people just thought of it as something that's superstitious rather than something that has a scientific basis. So during that time, also X-rays were becoming very popular, and X-rays enabled surgeons to practice surgery more conservatively and with greater accuracy than was provided prior through exploratory surgery. And this lessened the appeal and the need for electrotherapy. And the emergence of effective drugs such as insulin and penicillin and its increasing popularity in the medical field played a role in the decline of electrotherapeutics. And as less interest in the field of electrotherapeutics also resulted in less funding and support for the development of the field in its research. So that also resulted in its rapid decline. So just to conclude, so in the presentation, we went through different practitioners and treatments and devices, and we were able to show that to some extent, these devices and treatments were effective in curing ailments. And we also showed possible reasons for its decline. We mentioned its lack of credibility from the mainstream medical establishment because there wasn't a proper understanding behind its science. Also, in its inability to compete with X-rays and pharmaceuticals, which resulted in lack of funding for further research, and also its tarnished reputation in the public. And the field of electrotherapeutics has a very bright future, as evidenced by Dr. Keidar's cold atmospheric plasma research, which is groundbreaking and is going to make a big dent in the future of treatments. So the next slide just shows our references. If anyone would like to get a copy, just text us and we'll charge you only $20. Last but not least, thank you to Dr. Keidar and Narsil for helping us conduct this research. We had a very great time doing this research and it was very fun. Hopefully we can continue if there's more to do, as well as Rabbi Hempflig, Dr. Friedman, Rabbi Farber, and the rest of JMED and JMED.